Hola, saludos, buenos días. ¿Me escuchan? Saludos a todos, buenos días. Gracias por conectarse en la mañana de hoy. Good morning to everybody, almost good afternoon. Estamos aquí desde la Escuela de Arquitectura en la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Mi nombre es Carola Ballester, decana asociada de la Escuela de Arquitectura. En nombre de nuestra decana, Mayra Jiménez y nuestro equipo en el decanato. Hoy le damos la bienvenida a nuestro conferenciante para comenzar con la segunda conferencia del ciclo de conferencias de este año académico, que nos da mucho placer y gusto poder compartirlas con todo el mundo a través de nuestra página Facebook Live, hacerla accesible. Saludamos también a los arquitectos y arquitectos paisajistas que se unen para sus horas de educación continua. Queremos darle la bienvenida a nuestro conferenciante que no es hispanoparlante, no habla español, o sea que ya mismo él entiende, me dijo que entiende un poquito. Pero, un poquito, ¿sí? Well, thank you very much, Bradley Cantrell, for being with us today, this morning, to offer our second conference in our cycle of conferences in this semester at the School of Architecture at the University of Puerto Rico. We're delighted to have you. Earlier, we spoke a little bit, but I myself am our landscape architect, so I'm very, very excited of having you today with us and at the School of Architecture. I'm going to speak a little bit about you, just a few sentences in Spanish, so please excuse me 1 minute, and then the conference is all yours. So, para los que no conocen al arquitecto paisajista, Bradley Cantrell, él se encuentra en la Universidad de Virginia, él es un chair y también es profesor de arquitectura paisajista en la Universidad de Virginia. Es un académico, obviamente, estudió un bachillerato de arquitectura paisajista en la Universidad de Kentucky y tiene una maestría en arquitectura paisajista de la Escuela Graduada de Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard. Su trabajo se centra en el papel de la información, de la informática en el diseño ambiental y ecológico. Ha ocupado varios cargos académicos en la Universidad de Harvard, en la Escuela de Diseño, en Rhode Island School of Design, en Louisiana State University y actualmente, como les dije, está en la Universidad de Virginia. Su trabajo en Luisiana durante la última década apunta a una serie de metodologías que desarrollan modos de modelado, simulación y computación integrada que expresan e involucran la complejidad de los sistemas físicos, culturales y económicos. El trabajo de Cantrell se ha presentado y publicado en varios lugares, revisado por pares a nivel internacional. A mí me sorprendió muchísimo que uno de los libros, ¿verdad?, que yo consultaba, que consulto hoy en día y que les hablo y lo presento para mis estudiantes en la clase de arquitectura paisajista, es Digital Drawing for Landscape Architecture, cuyo autor es Bradley Cantrell. Y también este libro ganó un premio de ASLA en el 2012. Por otra parte, también es autor de otra publicación que usamos mucho también de referencia en la arquitectura paisajista y pues arquitectos también, Modeling the Environment. O sea que los dejo entonces con nuestro arquitecto paisajista para comenzar la conferencia. Bradley, thank you so much again for being with us today, for offering us this conference. It's all you.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and make my screen full screen here, and then. So we're seeing that?
Yeah, we can see.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carola, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation for being here today. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present my work and my outlook on the discipline of landscape architecture, and more broadly, the ability of computation to shape ecological systems and its kind of efficacy as a design tool. So today, I'd like to outline a view of the built environment that I believe is critical to develop as designers in the coming century. The problems we face in the environment are larger than ever before. They're embedded with an infinite complexity, and they're outside typically of our cognitive and cultural understanding. Landscape itself, I believe, can provide a sinuous connection between our lives, the architecture we inhabit, the urbanism that expresses our desire, and the environments that sustain our very existence. Most importantly, this landscape, the terra, the aqueous bodies, and the atmospheric envelopes must be reimagined, both regarding how we see and relate to it, but also in how we propose our future. We've positioned the discipline of landscape architecture as a body of knowledge that can design across scales and produce controlled scenarios from the molecule to the territory, but we're still proposing a future based on the praxis that we defined by modernism. It's a quest for truths and subsequent propositions that are typically couched in ideas of certainty about behaviors. So just to set up some of the conditions here, what I want to do today, as I mentioned, is give this kind of broad overview. I'm going to start with just giving kind of an idea about how a way of seeing the world that I think is important. Then talk about landscape's role in that, and then get into some kind of cases and some of the work I've been doing that I think sits within this realm. So the contemporary environmental condition is one of ecological hybrids. It's an evolved state where constructed megaliths exist within noisy gradients of the pseudo-natural. These landscapes, these hybridized territories, are the product of the exertion of civil engineering, environmental management, and the pressure of urbanization. So the question comes up, where does the discipline of landscape architecture stake its footing in this ecologically complex and technologically abstract realm of contemporary society? To confront the intractable issues of our time, it's necessary to unpack the technologies and subsequent interactions that operate at the scale of the territory. Within this, there's some pieces that I believe are really important. So the interface between the built environments and these evolving biological and geological systems that we interface with, they require a blurring of our previous strategies. And really this is to address forms of simulation, sensing, logistics, biological engineering, and technological interface. And at the heart of that, begin to question the dichotomy between the constructed and the natural. So the interface between the built environments and these evolving biological and geological systems become extremely important. It's necessary that the discipline takes a stance that designing this at the scale of the territory, I believe requires the application of reflexive and responsive techniques, technologies, and methods. And really to propose infrastructural landscapes that are situated within evolving landscape systems, feedback loops that allow our design propositions to become more than what the initial proposition is. So it's the interstitches then of these new relationships that become the medium in which the discipline of landscape architecture can examine new potentials for construction and maintenance as a starting point to propose landscape and landscape change across kind of large-scale systems. This quote comes from Kelly Shannon and Marcel Smith, and really talking about landscape as infrastructure. I think it's apt. They say, once married with architecture, and they're talking about infrastructure, once married with architecture, mobility, and landscape, infrastructure can more meaningfully integrate territories, reduce marginalization and segregation, and stimulate new forms of interaction. And at that point, it truly becomes landscape. So what is this? What is this kind of new, or what is this kind of view on the landscape as territory? So this hybridized landscape or ecology is what I would term a cyborg. And it's positing that the role of landscape architecture is in designing and implementing technologies and interfaces that promote active and real-time methods of environmental stewardship and management. These methods span a range of scales, from micro adjustments of chemical processes, things like fertilizers, to automated construction, to regional management and monitoring, to large-scale global remote sensing systems. Primarily, the concept then of a cyborg ecology, it's creating a recursive or iterative relationship between design, computation, and environmental processes. Landscape as a discipline has long grappled with the material craft of landscape. And so the actual building of landscapes themselves and its subsequent connection then with these large-scale systems. These shifts in scale are primarily addressed, but they're typically through discourse and hints of connectivity between the kind of human scale and the territorial scale. And these are moments where the complexity of the territory is drawn back down into the scale of the human figure. I have a whole range of things I would love to talk about that, but I'll kind of leave it at that for the moment. And there is little doubt that the rhetoric permeating the discipline itself states the effectiveness of the landscape architect as the planner of the territory, particularly as it relates to sociocultural issues, biophysical properties, and ecological fitness. But what becomes harder to decipher in the discipline is how that stated agency manifests itself on the ground in actionable and nimble forms that live up to the discourse that is developed around process, indeterminacy, and dynamism or flux. The discipline aims to conceptualize and articulate the territory as an adaptive infrastructure in this sense then. The landscape in a state of flux as it responds to changing environmental, programmatic, market, and sociocultural conditions. So this is, when I say the discipline, my view of the discipline. Sometimes I think this comes up through a somewhat cynical lens, and I think this quote from John May, can maybe point to that. And he says, our managerial posture demands that all of life be displaced to a condition beyond the natural and artificial, to an ontological plane where such distinctions no longer make sense and can no longer interfere with the choreographing of matter. So in this sense, the kind of sensorial aspects, the kind of issues that the things that make kind of environmental processes what they are, I think through the lens of simulation and abstraction often get overly generalized and get reconstructed, and anything that gets in the way is problematic. And I think this quote is apt in that regard. And what my propositions here kind of try to push beyond that common practice and the way we're working with landscape systems. But I think what becomes important then is an approach that places emphasis on some other aspects, aspects that we often try to kind of push away in design processes. It asks us to place emphasis on the contingent, the provisional, and the conditional. And it asks designers to amplify instability in landscape systems, while also inventing new types of landscape and forms. So it's a kind of rethinking that stability may not be our goal at all times. Therefore, the landscape, both physical and ephemeral, formal and indeterminate, is a starting point as we begin to generate the maintaining of complex environments. And you'll hear I use this term, rather than designing complex environments, this idea of maintaining or curating, oftentimes I think is an important way to start to think about the design at this scale. And so in this, we can't approach the design of territorial systems through an idea of control. Instead, we need to move away from this kind of idea that we're going to create some way of knowing everything. And I think Jennifer Gabrus' quote here from her program Earth book is really important, where she's starting to discuss the sensing of the environment and how we might begin to use a broad range of sensing systems. And she says, if the satellite view has largely been narrated as a project of making a global observation system and seeing Earth as a whole object, then the more distributed monitoring performed by environmental sensors points to the ways in which the Earth might be rendered not as one world, but as many. And I think this kind of way I'm describing this, and this quote starts to get at something that's really, really important here about how we might engage the Earth through many of the new technologies that we've been deploying. So in some ways, why do I believe landscape is at the center of this kind of idea of infrastructure and the territory? So landscape has the ability to integrate the environmental, social, and scalar challenges that are at play in territories. And I think furthermore, landscape architecture absorbs and hybridizes these multiple functions in ways that engineering, environmental science, and planning alone cannot. Landscape also offers operational frameworks and modes of integration that emphasize dynamics, change, and adaptation. And these are mechanisms that are in play in complex systems. It's essential to address landscape both as a medium we use to design and as a mechanism for testing and prototyping interventions that reshape the territory. So rather than understanding these as two separate things, the medium of landscape and the idea of using it as a prototype, we really need to think of them as kind of a single kind of way of approaching things. And it suggests that working kind of at larger scales and with complex systems, that we need to develop design approaches that privilege ideas of experimentation and iteration at one-to-one in the landscape, ways of generating knowledge just through the interventions themselves. This would, I think, is really sits on the edge of playful and critical prototyping, and it leads to pathways to what I would call responsive landscape systems. And these approaches, I think, are necessary to operate at this scale. I'm just making sure I'm going to be on time here to some degree. So let's talk a little bit about then kind of the scale that we're talking about and the planet in the way that I'm starting to describe it. So human societies have reshaped ecological patterns and processes across the Earth, and this is a common story that we're all familiar with, particularly this term, the Anthropocene, and what it describes in regards to our influence on the planet. We do this both directly through land use and by facilitating the movement of species, as well as indirectly through pollution and climate change, as examples. Even in protected wilderness areas, it has become a challenge to sustain ecological patterns and processes without increasingly frequent and intensive management interventions, including the control of invading species, management of endangered populations, and pollution remediation. Further, such interventions themselves may further alter ecological patterns and processes. And so the planet in the Anthropocene is a diverse and complex landscape. It's functioning at every scale. And it's crystallized across a static framework of infrastructure. These are physical and logistical. Canals connecting disparate watersheds, pumps pushing water uphill to defy gravity, pollinators transported for crops, and thousands of kilometers of levees, irrigational technology that will repattern regions. And what I mentioned before, it's a literal cyborg of contemporary humanity in our societies. The infrastructural framework that we've placed on the earth is bold. I think we can all see this. It's produced via applied capital to transform the hydrologic, climatic, and ecological regimes of the entire planet. Its success, though, relies on predictability. It relies on models that define the future via abstraction and simplification. And therefore, the friction that I believe is unraveling the planet that we occupy today is situated where the environmental dynamics of territories confront the stasis of this aging technological, political, and social infrastructure. So to promote what I would say is a neo-projective language for territorial landscape intervention, it's necessary to understand the influence that infrastructures impress upon landscape systems. And so what I mentioned just a moment ago. And so historically, the implementation of landscape infrastructure has relied on a regime of these fixed epistemological networks, or frameworks, sorry. When we begin to describe large-scale landscape systems, we speak about them through verifiable truths and ideas that are seemingly self-evident, but they're also calculated, modeled, and verified as a basis for the proposal of megaliths, giant levee systems, spillways, dams, infrastructure that is constructed and operates at the scale of the watershed of the continent. And in these systems, extremely complex systems where these infrastructures are placed, what is unknown is quickly excluded from the equation, or often over-engineered in the need for safety and predictability. So what happens then is that stasis, or the lack of dynamism, becomes the defining factor of landscape frameworks at this scale. And these are frameworks that are often set within a viscous and vigorous environment that demands for change and is often erasing our own history. So to operate within this realm requires the embrace of new vocabularies, things like calculated failure and adaptation, design strategies that rely on adaptation via prototyping, framing the landscape as a laboratory to test the effects of systems at scale. So to explore these facets, I'm going to describe some aspects of my work that I begin to capture these attributes. In my own work, some of the oldest projects are the most comprehensive, but also the most naive. And some of these more recent projects interrogate specific themes. And I'm going to talk about two very quickly that interrogate some of these kind of nascent ideas. So one of these is a drawing project that had kind of multiple lives, and this was co-authored with a landscape architect, Emma Mendel. This was for the 2019 Chicago Architectural Biennial and the Drawing Codes exhibition, which is a traveling exhibition. One piece of this was an animation that really started to look at many of the kind of environmental failures that have defined contemporary society since the beginning of the definition of the Anthropocene in 1610. And part of this then was also a drawing process that started to try to think through how we might make propositions in a landscape of failure. And so this whole project was called Failure. So I'm going to read just a couple quotes, and then I'll jump to some of the next sections here. But so failure is at the heart of landscape. Environments inherently complex, multivalent relationships in constant flux with indeterminate beginnings and endings. As designers, the dominant paradigm avoids failure, attempting to predict externalities through ever more complex modes of simulation. Complexity beguiles prediction, making it impossible to predict whether or not one unprecedented event is more likely to occur over another. And so this is the realm that we sit within. However, it's through the embrace of failure that we develop systems that more readily recover from disturbance, systems that lack fragility and have the ability to respond to unknown outcomes. This requires a paradigm shift. And how do we operate in a world that understands it cannot predict a chaotic future, an environment that embraces complexity but rejects predictability? So the application of failure is formed through continual testing, applying stress and digesting the outcome, the product of accumulation and eradication, revisited through irregular schedules, feigned technical competence, and sparks of response. It's a method that has little explanation without post-rationalization, requiring new eyes to determine its history and purpose, like an anthropologist sifting through cultural artifacts. So this is coming from the drawing we created for this, and in this, it was two individuals developing a kind of range of layers, erasing each other's work, getting rid of one another's work, drawing over, etc., and developing this drawing. And in a way, the writing we did around this was one of our takes to start to speak about what this idea of failure might be. So I'll just read the last paragraph, and then we'll move forward. So in this concept of failure, we attempt to represent the fragility of a single representation. No moment is whole. Each action cannot exist as an entity or contain meaning. And it's formed through the traces of others, but can be re-related in any order. It can be misaligned, contorted, inverted, or erased. We called this an anti-method. It's coded through the process of chemical transfers, eroded edges, spills and erasures, and through kind of the misuse of computational algorithms. Complexity in landscape pushes back on our obsession of attempting to find a non-existent order. And it's really what I would say a centuries-long fool's errand. So I put this idea of failure out there. I promise it won't stay this abstract as we move forward. And the other one is a project I won't go deeply into, but it's a collaboration also with landscape architects Fionn Byrne and Emma Mendel. But in this project, and this is for the LA Plus, the University of Penn design competition where we were finalists. But in this competition, we really looked at how, by developing a new vocabulary, so the design brief was to design an island, by designing a new vocabulary to talk about islands, we begin to kind of transform what an island is. And this project really does that. It also then begins to use a live modeling medium. And so what I mean by that is we use the growth of molds as a way to talk about the life and death of an island, and this kind of continuity. But once again, just a technique to begin to explore some of these concepts. So these kind of two abstract ideas of new definitions of landscape systems and this concept of uncertainty or failure as key elements for addressing complexity in the territory. So what I'd like to do next is begin to go into some of the work that I've been doing. This is through funded research and labs that I've been creating over the past several years, and talk a little bit about how the development of new types of tools are a really important aspect of that work. And so part of this is, and this is a quote from Levi Bryant, but he says, to be in a world is to be decentralized. It's to lack all mastery and to be a participant in an assemblage, network, or composition that exceeds society, culture, and oneself. And this idea that we are, all of our work that we're doing in territorial systems becomes highly relational. And it's not just relational after it's constructed, but it's relational through its entire life. And that kind of symbiotic interaction at the territorial scale becomes a kind of critical aspect of how we imagine a future, particularly a future of humanity on this earth, and the kind of invention of new technologies for that. So to basically have agency in the territory, I believe requires tools and strategies that construct a new type of epistemology, and that is one that is adaptive. It's not about defining truths and sticking to them. It is about continually developing a new knowledge base that we're responding to in even greater cycles. So it's an ability, as I mentioned before, to create prototypes, but these are prototypes that aren't just about defining the final intervention, but instead the prototype becomes the intervention itself. It exists within the life of the landscape, and it becomes this feedback loop, and that kind of moves beyond this idea of hyper efficiency and control. And this term, adaptive epistemology, which I call this lecture, if there's interest, there's a philosopher, James Feebleman, who wrote a series of books out of Tulane University. But he describes one of those books is called Adaptive Knowing, epistemology from a realistic standpoint, that I think that there's some that I'm pulling some from here. So the idea of adaptive epistemology for design is necessary to not only adjust theoretical frameworks, but it's also to develop new tools. And a lot of my work has been around this idea of developing new tools for modeling, for design, and how we might begin to use those to make new propositions about the world around us. And so this is taken on many different forms. This video you're seeing here comes from a model that we developed at Louisiana State University many years ago. This is for a group called Dredgefest, who is giving a workshop at LSU. And in this model, what we're trying to develop is a way of working with what we're calling a live medium. So and not only is it live, but it's tangible. We can do something as simple as put our finger in it, like the same way you would put your finger in the kind of sands at the beach and see its effect. But by working with a model like this, we're able to begin to kind of reimagine our forms of intervention. And the idea here is that we're not just making a proposition and placing it in the landscape and then maintaining that proposition, but instead we're thinking about those propositions existing over the life of a landscape. And part of these kind of initial models started to do this. In this model, at the bottom, we had a series of gates that were controlled by servos, and then we're essentially getting the spot elevations of the sand as it moves down the model. And then we're opening and closing those gates to basically direct or choreograph how that sand is moving. So this is this idea that we're beginning to use one infrastructure to choreograph another landscape or another environment becomes a kind of critical aspect of this. And you can see this, in this case, we're just using the kind of concept of the spillway and then are moving the gates and choreographing them in order to construct different landscape forms. What's interesting about this, and it'll come up in another project shortly, but is that you're never repeating the same landscape twice, and in that you're instead opening and closing the system, or kind of in a way playing this instrument. And creating something that is close to what you believe it will be, but is never always the same composition. This work that I've been working on has been situated at Louisiana State University, then at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and now here at the University of Virginia. There's a kind of broad range of other researchers and academics and professionals doing similar work. SCAPE took on some of this work recently in the Resilience by Design competition. Other firms are taking on kind of similar versions of this, as well as other academics like Alexander Robinson, Brian Davis, who's here at UVA now, Brett Milligan, and others. Some of this work comes from kind of a long history of computational and physical modeling in North America. This is often led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That also then comes from a longer history, something I'd also be happy to talk about, of modeling that started in France and Germany pre-World War II. But this kind of, we've been grappling with this kind of idea of modeling complex systems and intervening in them, and this is kind of situated within that, definitely within that history. If we want to kind of think of this idea and some of these ideas, I'll just kind of paint a quick picture here, but almost 40% of the people across the world are living within 100 kilometers of coastal and riverine environments. And I think speaking to a crowd, in Puerto Rico, the dynamics of these kind of large-scale systems are definitely self-evident. What this means, though, is that 3/4 of the world's cities and critical infrastructure are situated next to the ocean. And as we're going through the uncertainties of climate change, there's a huge requirement to adapt to these fluctuating sea levels and increased storm events. My belief is, and I think most people's belief is, that this is going to be a monumental task. We're currently addressing it through larger preventive infrastructures, but this doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the way we're going to stem the tide as we move forward. So we will need new methods of adaptation, forms of retreat, and new types of construction that are really outside of the scope of our current capabilities. And it's going to be important to reimagine how the coast is reformed to provide the complexity that has been slowly eroded, while also allowing for human habitation. So much of this research that I've been doing was, as I mentioned, was realized at Louisiana State University and the GSD, and it's now part of our labs here at UVA. This is coming from an exhibit at Harvard from our lab there. This is one of the kind of later models. So I showed you this other model that we developed. This is a model that we did in collaboration with a group called EM River. And we designed this in a couple different ways. We developed this to simulate dynamic riverine and coastal environments. And in a way, this becomes the site in which designers begin to develop approaches to fluctuating hydrological systems. What I think is important in this is that we really began to think through this as a way to break away from simulation. So rather than trying to reconstruct the physical world through models, either physical or computational, instead we're creating essentially a new space to design in that is trying to address process and how we begin to interface with process. So in this sense, we're trying to take these dynamic or live models, and then we're developing a series of sensing systems that overlay this. And these are used to get surface morphology or the topography, to get stream flow, center lines of waterways, soil moisture levels. And the way we've designed this model is that we've also have a series of apparatuses that allow us to have very specific seeding conditions. And what I mean by that is we can have different sediment mixes going into the table, different hydrological graphs in order to simulate rainfall or storm systems. But all of these then allow us to begin to work in predictable ways with this very dynamic model. And what you see from this is a model that begins to very closely represent the dynamics of particularly deltaic systems, but also braided river systems, meandering rivers, backwater swamps, even tidal zones. And while it's not a simulation of any particular delta or river, it does have this what Chris Paola references as an unreasonable effectiveness. So what we see here very closely simulates what we see in the real world, and we can use that as a way to then begin to think about design interventions in these models. The other aspect of this is that it creates a tangible environment that begins to generate a huge range of conditions. So, as I mentioned before, with that first model, you can put your hand in this and alter it. You can develop, robotic models that interface with this and change it. And you can also set up ways of sensing this. And all of those become prototyping methods to think about what might happen out in the physical world. And so just to give you some other views here. So like in this case, you're just seeing a very specific sediment mix being brought into the system. And that's once again being kind of developed on the fly. And we're using a synthetic sediment for this, and you can just see some of the patterning that occurs, which is, begins to mimic, a delta or river system. As I mentioned, the model has this kind of physical component, water running through sediment over time, but we've also then just began designing all kinds of ways of beginning to sense and bring that information into different databases. So I went over these before, but like using ultrasonic sensors, capacitive sensors, we're using these as ways to then create these ancillary computational models or representations that we can see right alongside the physical model. And this is just showing one of those ultrasonic sensors, but the ultrasonic sensors are extremely accurate, and we use these in tandem with the Microsoft Connect, which gives us a much rougher model. But this is giving us kind of a millimeter or sub-millimeter level accuracy, and allows us to basically get spot elevations, and these spot elevations here are just being represented as a section. Or using things like the Connect, we're able to get this kind of real-time point cloud, and being able to have this in connection with that tangible model gives us this environment to really design within. Part of this process has also been to write custom software to help visualize this, and this is just some of the views from one piece of software that was written. In this case, being able to cut sections through the model in real time. See the kind of transformations that are being made within the model, and work with it. And then the other thing that's happening here that is not seen is that this point cloud that we're visualizing is also being recorded into a database, and we can then access any moment in time in that model, and bring them into other types of software like Rhino or 3D Studio Max, or anything that will take a point cloud model. So this is a modeling system, I think, is kind of one aspect of a tool that we've been exploring that I believe is really important. It does create an idea that in order to begin to work within highly complex and dynamic systems, we have to have this kind of real-time connection with it, and that real-time connection starts to become this feedback between kind of the human senses and this kind of vast array of ways of sensing the environment and modeling the environment, and that those two elements in tandem give us new ways of making propositions about large-scale infrastructure and large-scale landscape moves. And in this is the other kind of aspect that I just put this picture up here for. This idea that we can begin working with these models and making propositions within them in ways that we immediately see the results, and cognitively can begin to process that. And so like this working environment or this laboratory environment, I think is one kind of very important way of thinking about things. And in that, conceptually, if we go back to kind of what I brought up at the very beginning and kind of ideas about how we address the scale of the territory, I would say conceptually this proposes a method of design that relies on the design of operations, and that these operations intervene locally, but they aggregate then to produce large-scale territorial change. So these are about kind of what we do on the ground, and then how the kind of aggregation of those interventions begin to cause larger change. I would say that this is importantly, this is a form of landscape choreography, and it's continually learning from itself by processing the results of its actions before choosing the next intervention. And in a way, this becomes a continuous call and response between these biological systems and an active and symbiotic infrastructural regime. This is just coming from a student project by Tyler Moore and Andrew Boyd, But in this project, they really began thinking about how the sensing and documentation systems on the geomorphology table could be used as a way to make propositions about new types of landscape topography or form. And what you see here is just some of the results of how they're using those sensing systems. And so in this, what you're seeing then is a way of using the ultrasonic sensors to develop a kind of continuous landscape section, while also then developing these palimpsest representations that speak to the range of topographic form that could be formed and which are more likely to happen than others. And so what you're seeing here are topographic representations that are speaking to likelihood of creation based on specific interventions within the hydrological and sediment deposition system, regime. Another version of this is the work of Leif Estrada, and Leif developed what I think is an extremely interesting proposition about the Los Angeles River channel. And I'm assuming many of us know about the Los Angeles River. It's running through the downtown Los Angeles and Long Beach. It's essentially a concrete channel that's just moving water extremely fast through the city to prevent any kind of backup or flooding, and it dumps it out into Long Beach Harbor. Leif is making a proposition here about how you might use a responsive system like this to essentially deconstruct that concrete river channel, and then recompose it downstream through different high water moments. And so this is in concert with this really dense urban fabric. Part of what he's doing here is looking, in this instance, making connections between the synthetic sediment we're using in the model and the construction materials that would be the concrete, the broken down concrete, gravel, and subsurface that would be available with the deconstruction of the channel. And then the approach really utilizes this idea of creating a series of interventions before high water moments. when large amounts of water pour through the river system, it would use these interventions to move the sediment in very specific ways to basically create a new riverbed. He set this up on servos because the time scale of this model is obviously much faster than the seasonal cycles of the Los Angeles River. But in this case, he could very quickly reposition the interventions and have a new high water moment, and these would each then kind of start to reconstruct themselves. Thinking through kind of each material and its performance and its interaction with the hydrology, and then really thinking about this new riverbed that would be constructed based on the interactions that guide kind of these future outcomes. And this is part of his work that builds off of that. That's really looking at probabilities of topographic form. This gets attached to the idea of what those downstream riverbed forms might start to look like, and how based on the amount of time that they're formed, like plant material and other species might begin to occupy those forms and create this new kind of riverine landscape. Really thinking through then the choreography of the sediment and the construction of a new riverbed and the emergence of new life within that riverbed, and how those might all be kind of choreographed together. And you can see kind of here kind of what that starts to look like, and with this kind of upstream debris piles, a high water moment that starts to move that debris down the river, and then the re-choreographing of that downstream condition. And so, I think it's to me a very interesting project that takes on kind of all of these kind of aspects that I was speaking about before, about how infrastructure might be more tightly intertwined within the dynamics of large-scale systems. And I know we have maybe about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to bring up one more project by Jun Liu. Her work has been really tightly tied with much of the work I've been doing recently. She's a PhD candidate and instructor here at the University of Virginia, and I'm her PhD advisor. But Jun's work is extremely interesting in that it's beginning to tie together different forms of computational simulation and physical simulation, and really thinking about what this new kind of hybrid might look like. She's developed a series of modeling tools that are that allow for real-time manipulation of fluid dynamic systems, and some of this you can see here, where you can make different types of interventions and quickly see the results. She's also then taken that kind of very abstract set of tools and has begun to apply those to site-specific conditions, and this then has been a way that she can begin to test out different types of interventions in hydrological landscapes, and including not only the movement of water, but also sediment and the capacity to carry seeds and other biological material. And then tying that together with, like I said, these kind of site-specific concepts, and beginning to use those tools as ways to make propositions about the reformation of river systems, in this case, very dynamic but compressed urban spaces. The work has also, in many ways, become really interesting in the fact that because she's designed these new tools, she's also then begun to reproject those back into this physical modeling environment, and creating ways to then not only work, with the geomorphology table as a modeling tool, but to see the results of that, things like slope analysis, viewshed analysis, hydrological performance, to not only see the kind of visual effects of that, but to get this computational analysis happening in real time as well. And so this has been a kind of a modification to the systems that we had developed in the past, but that incorporates this projection back into the table, and a new set of sensing systems that really starts to build off of that. And in the same way, these tools have also then, another focus of this work is really then also developing the interface. And so these have been a series of components in Rhino and Grasshopper that begin to give people access to the ability to do kind of the things, these types of things with physical models. So you can see some of these some of the outputs from this here. And kind of how working in real time, she's able to begin to not only project form and then work with that and see the kind of output through attributes like water flow or ecological succession, but then to kind of reverse that process as well. These are some of the projections that you were seeing. And you can see, what becomes interesting in this kind of right-hand slide is the feedback between the actual physical model, or the actual water moving over the model, and the projection, and how those two are not always one-to-one. And even that alone, I think, begs a kind of interesting conversation about the computational numerical model and the physical model. So I know I'm going to run out of time, but I'll leave it on this slide at the end. So ideally, the work, the framing of this hopefully was helpful for you, but ideally the work and the modeling work here helps to enhance the tool set of the architect and landscape architect, and develop design approaches that utilize really this kind of expanding command of computation in the disciplines. It proposes this method of landscape intervention that I believe collapses ideas of representation, analysis, documentation, and construction. So kind of pulls those all together into one thing. And this really requires a tactical approach to landscape formation. And as I mentioned before, it relies on the design of the operation itself. And these operations, rest within the local observation and sensing, as well as longer term forecasting. Quite honestly, it's, what the results of these aren't necessarily the landscape itself. And you can see from Leif Estrada's work that it requires this visualization of how those landscapes become something that we occupy. But it does begin to address a lot of ways that we might procedurally change our design methods. And it's this feedback between sensing systems, machine intelligence or simulation, and landscape modification, and it creates a way of constructing and interfacing and maintaining the territory that is both tunable and I believe challenges methods of complex simulation and our legacy of static infrastructures. The goal in this obviously is to move beyond our known forms of representation and design methods, and instead is to really develop these tools that address ideas around flux, indeterminacy, and process. And so, thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Can you see the questions on the screen?
I can. Yep. Let me just turn up my volume here a little bit. Okay. So, would you like me to read the question?
If you want to.
Okay. So it says, hi Bradley, I find this presentation extremely relevant. At this point in time, I feel we have confirmed that ignoring our environment is not a suitable choice. I would love to know more about what exactly you are quantifying and revealing to inform in some of your graphics. I'm interested in the translation of your data into graphics. Also, if you can share unexpected discoveries you have made by paying attention to ecological data. So thank you for the question. So I think it's a good question, and it's an important one. So I think there's a couple different things that become important about the propositions I'm making. In some sense, the visuals there are visualizations that I'm showing that are really in a similar way that you might draw and diagram on trace. Some of those visualizations we're showing from the models are really ways of building new types of intuition, and that's often the way we think about them. That they show a condition that we might not have seen before, and even more importantly, they show us that condition happening over time, or in real time with another condition like the physical model itself. And so those visualizations are generative in that capacity, and that I believe they change the way we see the way kind of territorial hydrology operates. And so it becomes less about like information about amounts of water moving through the system or amounts of sediment, and instead becomes really about a way of understanding the kind of the procedural or operational aspect of those systems. There's others that I showed in some of these slides that take on a whole nother type of visualization that I think is actually really critical. And part of that is, and some of the slides I showed in the beginning did this, and one of my colleagues here, Matthew Seibert, does a really amazing job of this, and some of them were in collaboration with him. But often it's taking historical data about that we've gathered over time about, say, for in some of these cases, the Mississippi River, and beginning to revisualize those through a landscape architectural lens. And part of that then is using our types of visualization to begin to allow us to have what I would say is deeper conversations with environmental scientists, engineers, and others. So they're kind of sit on both sides of that. Now, there's work that I haven't shown here that that we're currently trying to develop, that is really then trying to take some of the kind of ecological models that we see, like ecological models about secession, and begin to use those as like layers that would exist on top of morphological models about sediment or sediment formation, and tying those two together in real time to see how a changing or dynamic landscape system might start to display these ecological models. So I mean, there's a broad range in there, but just to give you a kind of idea, like 3 ways of kind of starting to see those. Yeah, so great question, Roman. So it says, is the object of these models and simulations about prediction to a certain degree? And then if so, what are the challenges when changing the scale from model to landscape? So one of the things that I think we're trying to address is this idea of prediction. And in the lecture, part of what I'm trying to say in there is, we've been, at least for the last century, working with a paradigm that has been that has really allowed us to occupy parts of the earth for much longer lengths of time than ever before, and has created actually much more stability across the planet. As I mentioned, there's a friction there, though, that as the world continues to evolve and change, our infrastructures are, our static infrastructures are kind of in this kind of tension with that. And I would say it's twofold. One, those infrastructures and the scales of them are actually altering the world itself. We're essentially recreating the planet in our image, in the image that we've created. And then the other is that because we can't predict the future as well as we would like to believe, we have these kind of eventual failures. So part of this idea with the models is to provide an environment that allows us to think about longer term, forecasting or modeling in correlation with very short term, sensing and monitoring that allows us to make informed decisions very rapidly. What I think that does is it changes the way we think about design and particularly landscape intervention. In the past, or not even in the past, currently, much of the way we think about that is that we need to develop more and more complex forms of simulation to essentially make a more and more accurate model of the world we live in, and using that model that we believe is more and more accurate about predicting the future, we will then be able to make an intervention in the world or an infrastructure or anything like this that performs better than previous iterations. I believe this idea that we need to go down this path of simulating the world in more and more accurate ways is meaningful in one sense, but it's not meaningful in the idea that we need to create a surrogate version of the world, the physical world we live in, so that we can redesign the physical world. So my hope is that the work is it relies somewhat on prediction, but it also relies on the idea that we want a world that's full of complexity, full of diversity, and not generalized or abstracted through models and then reconstructed. So I think ideally this idea that it might be possible, and these are more guesses that I have, and this is like hypotheses that the work is spawning from, but conceptually, it's possible then to make an intervention, and that to be the first move, and to learn from that intervention, and then make the next move. So in a way, we are slowly altering the world, and those alterations are aggregating, as opposed to needing to model the whole complex system and then use that as the future prediction. Because basically what we do with that future prediction is that if it doesn't actually go in that direction, which it typically alters, we instead use the infrastructure to reshape the system into the form that we want it to be in. And an example of that is the Mississippi River watershed. Much of the modeling we did in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and into the 60s around the Mississippi River used a certain form for the river, and that form is the one that we've basically kept in place today. And it's one that especially the lower reach of the Mississippi is highly dynamic, always changing course, building new deltaic lobes. And what we've done with that is we've kind of held it in place. And this is a kind of issue with the model and issue with the infrastructures we built around it. So hopefully that answers the question to some degree. So this is a question, how do I believe this type of landscape modeling might be applied to urban planning, and particularly around issues of climate change? And then would it be something that would integrate into the way we plan cities, agriculture, and how is this modeling used in unpredictable environment situations and cases? So there's a lot there. I do believe there's, conceptually, there's a kind of cross-pollination among other ways of thinking about modeling. If we think about something like informal settlements, there's a certain symbiosis and adaptability to informal settlements that I think is important to draw from. There's a part of informal settlement that I would say that is due to kind of neglect and a lack of attention that is highly problematic. But this idea that settlement in cities might evolve in ways that make a small move, look at the results, and then make the next move. Which is what I'm talking about in regards to landscape infrastructure. I believe as an urban planning method to me could be a very interesting approach. And so rather than thinking about whole sectors of the city that are planned out at once, how might we begin to think about this kind of like much smaller scale incremental approach to those systems? So I do believe there's some kind of there is something to that as a concept. And I don't remember the last part of that question, so I apologize. So in unpredictable environments, and then across things like integrating, so I think the first part I talked about, and I think agriculture could take on a similar idea about what I just said about planning. And in unpredictable environments, I think, I do believe this is what I am trying to address in the talk. This idea of when I say unpredictable environments, there's these different levels of unpredictability, and part of what the work is obviously spawned from a highly unpredictable environment like the Mississippi River Delta, and so this is where I see the work having the most effect. Right, it's these kind of highly stable regions where I think it has less it's less meaningful, but I do believe this idea of this kind of aggregating approach is one that is suited perfectly for the unpredictable. So paradoxically, as climate change impacts progress over our built and natural environments, we have been experiencing a decrease of leadership from architects and landscape architects in relation to civil or hydrological engineers leading water management infrastructure projects like treatment plants, dams, weirs, and others. What advice can you provide to future generations regarding the hybridizing of architectural programs? So I think this is it's a really great question. One aspect of this, one of my colleagues here at UVA, I think, is really diving into this topic, and if you're interested to take a look at his work, his name is Brian Davis, and I think, I won't make assertions for him, but I think in this, there is an idea that, as landscape architects and architects, we are often brought into large-scale infrastructural projects, after they've been planned, and in a way, we're asked to add program on top of it, essentially. And so this is often, happens in lots of different ways, but we're, in a way, we're brought in kind of in the later stages. And I would say that in the beginnings of the work that I was doing, particularly when I was in Southern Louisiana, part of this goal was to understand the process engineers were using and environmental scientists were using, the way they were seeing these kind of large-scale systems and the kind of infrastructural interventions, so that as landscape architects, we might be able to influence them much earlier in the process. And I'm not sure in this about things like water treatment plants, although I do believe there's probably kind of ideas there. But things like dams, weirs, levee systems, they are designed currently, and water treatment plant fits in this category too. But they're designed currently in a way that are about optimization and efficiency over kind of very like single variables typically, and that's typically about, in river systems, about moving water at a constant velocity so that we don't, so that the water doesn't back up or flood. And that's to, protect critical infrastructure, protect cities, for, safety. All of those are extremely important. The other aspect, though, is that there is much more complexity typically in those river systems. And how do we then begin to imagine that not only these kind of optimizations for safety are important, which they are, but also sociocultural programs, ecological fitness, all of those are weaved together with similar priorities. It doesn't mean that there's any less safety in those systems, but it does mean that they may need to take up more space in the landscape, or they may need to be radically reconceived. And that by developing a much more multivariate view, I think requires multiple disciplines to be collaborating earlier in the process. And part of my work, particularly early in my career, was very much about how can I be integrated earlier in that process. And that has played out in multiple ways, but particularly through consulting and work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and individuals like Brian Davis here or Michael Lugering are also taking on a similar approach.
Well, I will interrupt now. As I think we're done with the questions, right? I know, Professor, that you have to teach your class. So, and we really appreciate, we just want to say that we really appreciate your time with our students and the other participants. I think you've definitely added to this conversation that we continue to need to have, the tools that design in general, and particularly landscape architecture, and particularly more for Puerto Rico, because we are surrounded by water, and then our island setting, and we do have a big mountain system that goes along the entire island in the towards the middle of the island. So there are a lot of waterways grow there, are born there, and so with climate change, we have water, issues that we're interested in talking more about and approaching them through design, that I think we have the tools. So it's a conversation that continues to grow with climate change and with, flooding happening a lot and posing security issues, environmental issues. So we really appreciate, I think, the nature of the conference and what was talked about was very, very rich and important to us as design students and to the professionals in the related fields. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time. And just so you know, when you come back to Puerto Rico, you must visit us.
I will.
So again, thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants joining us today. The conference will be in our page on the Escuela de Arquitectura UPR Facebook page. So if you didn't have a chance to join, everybody will have a chance to see it further along. So thanks again, Brandon. Thank you to all of you. Buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Muchas gracias por participar de la conferencia de hoy. Hasta luego. Thank you so much. Bye.